The wind here doesn't just blow, it screams. It tears across the Barents Sea, unhindered by land for 1,000 miles, until it slams into a tiny hook-shaped island at the very roof of the world. If you stand on the shore of Vardoe today, looking out into the polar darkness, you might see a series of small, dim lights glowing from a sleek, modern structure. 91 lights. But if you stood on this same shore on Christmas Eve, 1617, you wouldn't be looking at lights. You would be looking at the apocalypse. That afternoon, the sky was clear. The ocean was calm. 40 men, the fathers, brothers, and sons of this tiny community, had rowed their small open boats out to fish. They were within sight of the church spire. And then, in the span of a single breath, the sky turned black. Survivors said the storm didn't roll in, it fell from the heavens like a hammer. The waves rose so high they blocked out the mountains. Within minutes, the noise was deafening. And then, just as quickly, silence. 10 boats, 40 men, gone. In a village of only a few hundred people, this wasn't just a tragedy, it was an extinction event. Suddenly, there were hardly any men left to fish, to build, to protect. The women were left standing on the ice-covered rocks, staring at an empty sea. And as the shock wore off, a dark, poisonous question began to take root in their minds. Storms don't happen like that. God doesn't kill 40 righteous men on the eve of his son's birth. Nature isn't this cruel. So, if it wasn't God and it wasn't nature, who did this? The answer they found would ignite a fire that would burn for 70 years. It would turn neighbor against neighbor, mother against daughter, and transform this frozen outpost into the European capital of the witch hunt. This is not a legend. This is the true story of how fear can drive a society to madness. To understand why this happened here, of all places, you have to look at the map. Vardoe is the easternmost point of Norway. It is further east than Istanbul. It sits on the same latitude as the northernmost tip of Alaska. In the 17th century, to the sophisticated elites in Copenhagen and Berlin, this wasn't just the edge of the map. This was the ultima thule, the end of the world. And according to the learned men of the church, the north was the domain of the devil. Literally. Theologians preached that the gates of hell were located physically in the freezing north. They believed that the cold air was thick with demons, that the whistling wind was the sound of lost souls. When the king of Denmark-Norway, Christian IV, looked at this territory, he didn't just see a fishing colony. He saw a spiritual battlefield. He saw a place where good Christians were surrounded by darkness, both literal and metaphorical. So he sent governors. He sent judges. He sent men from Germany and Scotland and Denmark, outsiders who didn't know the land, didn't know the people, and were terrified of the dark. They arrived carrying books on demonology and a mandate to cleanse the land. And the first thing they found was the storm of 1617. In the eyes of these foreign officials, a storm that killed 40 men was an act of malachim, harmful magic. They needed a culprit. And the grieving widows of Vardoe, starving and terrified, began to whisper names. The first victim was a woman named Maren. Under interrogation, she didn't just confess to casting a spell. She gave the inquisitors a story so vivid, so terrifying, that it became the blueprint for every trial that followed. She said that on Christmas Eve, demons had come to her. She said she and the other women had flown over the town of Domburg, transformed into ravens and cormorants. She said they had untied a magical knot in a handkerchief, unleashing the wind that shattered the boats. Why would she say this? Was she insane? Was she hallucinating from starvation? Or did she know that if she gave them a story, a really good story, the torture might stop? Marie was burned alive. But before she died, she gave names. This is the mechanism of the terror. The crimen exceptum. Witchcraft was considered an exceptional crime, which meant the normal rules of justice did not apply. You didn't need physical evidence. You didn't need witnesses to the act. All you needed was a confession. And to get a confession, the law allowed the use of painful questioning. Imagine the water test. This was the gold standard of proof in Vardoe. They would take a woman, tie her thumbs to her big toes, and throw her into the freezing Arctic Ocean. The logic was twisted but absolute. Water is a pure element used in baptism. If the woman was a witch, the pure water would reject her, and she would float. If she was innocent, the water would accept her, and she would sink. Sink and you might drown, but at least you die a Christian. Float and you are pulled out, dried off, and burned at the stake. In Vardoe, the records show that every single woman who was subjected to the water test floated. Single. What? Perhaps it was the layers of wool skirts trapping air. Perhaps it was the dense salt water. It didn't matter. To the judges, it was the judgment of God. But the horror in Vardoe wasn't just about men killing women. It was about the disintegration of trust. Fast forward to 1662. The hysteria has been simmering for decades, rising and falling like the tides. But now, it reaches a fever pitch. And at the center of this new storm is a child. Her name is Maren. She is 12 years old. Maren is an orphan of the fires. Her mother was burned as a witch. Her aunt was burned as a witch. She has grown up in the shadow of the stake, an outcast, a witch's brat. In 1663, the authorities bring her in. But they don't treat her as a suspect initially. They treat her as a witness. They need her to confirm the guilt of others. And Maren, terrifyingly, gives them everything they want. But there is a twist here, a detail that makes this specific trial unique in history. Maren didn't come up with these stories on her own. She was being coached. Enter Anna Rodius. Anna was not a fisherman's wife. She was an aristocrat, the wife of a disgraced doctor, exiled to this frozen rock from the comforts of Oslo. She was educated, bitter, and dangerous. She found herself locked in the same fortress as the accused peasant women, and she began to manipulate them. She told Maren what to say. She fed the 12-year-old girl details from continental demonology books, stories about black Sabbaths, about Satan playing a red violin, about beer parties inside the Hollow Mountains. Maren, desperate for approval, desperate to be useful, repeated it all in court. Imagine the scene. A cold, stone courtroom in the Vardoe's fortress. Men in velvet robes looking down at a dirty, shivering 12-year-old girl. And she points a finger at the women who had fed her when she was hungry. The women who had been her mother's friends. She was there, Maren says. And her. Because of Maren's testimony, 5 women were burned in a single day. One of them was Ingeborg, the wife of Petter Krog. She was tortured so brutally that she died in her cell before they could get her to the stake. But the sentence had to be carried out. So they dragged her corpse out to the pyre and burned it anyway. The law demanded that the fire consume the evil, living or dead. But there is another group of victims here that history often leaves in the footnotes. While the majority of those burned were Norwegian women, about 1/5 of the victims were men. And almost all of those men were Sami. The Sami are the indigenous people of the north. They lived here long before the Norwegians, surviving the harsh climate through reindeer herding and a deep spiritual connection to the land. Their shamans, known as No-ID, used rune drums to predict the weather and heal the sick. To the Danish governors, the Sami were terrifying. They didn't just look different or speak a different language. They practiced magic openly. The witch trials became a convenient tool for cultural genocide. When a Sami man was accused, the charges were different. They weren't accused of flying on broomsticks or kissing the devil. They were accused of Gand, sending projectile spirits to strike people down. They were accused of owning a rune drum. For a Sami No-ID, his drum was his map to the spirit world. The prosecutors called it an instrument of Satan. They burned the drums. Then they burned the men. It's a brutal reminder that witch hunts are rarely just about superstition. They're about power. They are about crushing the other. So, how did it stop? How do you turn off a machine that runs on fear? It stopped because of one man who decided to do his job. His name was Mandrup Petterson Shunnibol. In the late 1660s, he was appointed as a distinctive judge for the region. He arrived in Finnmark and began to review the cases. And what he saw appalled him. He saw the water tests. He saw the torture. He saw the hearsay. And for the first time in 50 years, someone in power said, "This is not evidence." He began to acquit women. He overturned death sentences. He argued that a confession obtained after hours on the rack was worthless. The local clergy were furious. They called him a protector of witches. They said he was endangering their souls. But Shunnabel stood his ground. He demanded that all capital sentences be appealed to the High Court in Copenhagen. This introduced bureaucracy into the panic. And bureaucracy is the enemy of hysteria. Once the cases had to be written down, shipped south, and reviewed by cool-headed lawyers in the capital, the conviction rate plummeted. The fires sputtered and died out. But the damage was done. By the time the smoke cleared, 91 people had been executed in Vardoe. In relation to the population, it was one of the most intense witch hunts in the history of humanity. And then, silence. For 300 years, the village tried to forget. The records were filed away. The execution site grew over with grass. Then came World War II. The Nazis burned Vardoe to the ground as they retreated in 1644, a scorched earth tactic that erased the physical history of the village. The trauma of the war overwrote the trauma of the trials. The victims became ghosts, twice removed. Until recently. If you go to Vardoe today, you will find the Steilneset Memorial. It sits on the exact spot where the stakes were driven into the frozen earth. It is a collaboration between the architect Peter Zumthor and the artist Louise Bourgeois. It consists of two parts. The first is a long, cocoon-like corridor suspended on a wooden frame. Inside, it is dark, narrow, and silent. As you walk down the hallway, there are 91 windows cut into the wall. Beside each window is a silk banner with a text from the original court records. Karen Edistad confessed to ruining a ship. Burned. Anders Poulsen confessed to using a rune drum. Axed to death. You have to walk past every single one. You have to read their names. Next to this corridor is a black glass cube. Inside, a single chair sits in the center. 5 gas flames burn around it, reflecting off the mirrors, so that no matter where you look, you see fire. You see the burning chair. And you see yourself, reflected in the glass, sitting in the flames. It forces you to ask the uncomfortable question. If I lived here in 1621, who would I be? Would I be the victim, screaming my innocence as the water closed over my head? Would I be the judge, convinced I was doing God's work? Or would I be the neighbor, the one who saw the storm, felt the fear, and whispered a name just to keep the focus off myself? The story of Vardoe is not just a story about the past. It is a warning. It shows us how quickly a community can turn on its own when it feels threatened. It shows us that when we are afraid, we don't look for logic, we look for a scapegoat. The 91 lights in the Arctic night are not just there to remember the dead. They are there to watch the living. Because the darkness didn't leave Vardoe. It just sleeps. And it sleeps in every town, in every city, waiting for the next storm to wake it up.